Okay, can we predict the future? It's one of two things we're going to talk about is predictive analysis and the ability to be able to predict the future. It's known as predictability. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was the economy and this coronavirus crisis. I've done some predictive analysis so far, and I've presented it. And there has been a sort of a pushback on predictability or the issue of predictability. This mostly comes from Nassim Taleb of the University of New York. Now, Dr. Taleb has not seen any of my videos and not commented on them or anything like that. But Dr. Taleb says that we cannot take a single point prediction or a single point analysis and be able to figure out what is going to be happening in the future. Now, I don't know if that is exactly what he's saying. He may be saying it, he may not. But I am saying myself that it's completely possible that we can predict future events, so we can see the consequences of our action by making predictive models. Dr. Taleb is now quite famous for his book Black Swan, and in showing and discussing about black swan events, he is saying that this crisis is not a black swan event, that it was completely predictable. It's a white swan event, which is a catastrophe that was completely predictable. I'm going to question that. I'm going to come back on that and make certain statements about that, but probably not in the way which you would think I'm going to do. Or that I would do. I'd also like to plug Dr. Taleb's book, which is Black Swan, and here is the link here. And while I'm at it, I may as well plug my own book. And now, regarding predicting the future, I'd like to say that if we have certain assumptions that in some way approximate reality, and second, if people keep doing the same thing, then we can make some reasonable predictions. However, people change their behavior, and everyone's not doing the same thing. So we have to, make adjustments for that, but we can actually deal with that. So first, let's look at the assumptions to approximate reality. We're saying that the disease spreads faster the more people who have it, and we can approximate that with exponential growth. And secondly, people develop an immunity. So it's not like everybody in the population is going to eventually contact the disease, or they might, but people build up an immunity, and we have to place that into the model because the virus runs out of hosts to infect. So we can obviously we can only approximate. People do change their behavior, so we therefore need to have a dynamic model rather than a static model. Now, this lends itself to a finite difference model, which can be altered as time goes along and more differentials can be added into the model. This would very much also exclude the use of something like a finite element model. These types of models are not robust enough to handle dynamic situations or dynamic inputs. A huge advantage to the modeler in this particular case is that this disease acts like a fractal. In other words, what happens on a small scale is also happening on a large scale, and vice versa. There are also a lot of different data sets that are coming from around the world, from different countries. And using that data, we can tell if we're on track. And we can compare two real data very, very quickly. And of course, everything does depend on the accuracy of the data. I mean, that goes pretty well without saying. So now I'd like to show you the principles of this model. I have a PowerPoint to be able to do that. I think some of you have seen that, and then we'll compare that to some countries. Okay, we're starting this with the change in y. The change in our dependent variable is k times the amount of people who are infected, y being the number of people who are infected, and that is, let's say, per unit time, and k now is the growth factor of how fast, let's say, percentage per day of increase in the in the spread of the disease. So if we take this, this will give us an infinite number of people, of course, who will be infected. So we throw a taper on that, as I've shown before. This taper is going to be basically it's number of people who are infected, y divided by the number of people who are left to be infected, which is the population, p minus y. And now, since this is a taper, that basically works on the probability of which you'll get it. Subtracting that from 1 negates that, and this will be a taper that kills the disease. And basically, this is just, it's a stochastic model based on the probability of getting it, where k is basically equal to the factor, it's two things actually, which I'll explain in the PowerPoint. So if we take this and we now turn that into a differential equation, this is our differential equation up here. We can set our initial values, let's say at t equals 0, y equals 1 to start the infection or to start the model. We take the integral on both sides, it's separable, and we can basically, this is the actual, I have c over 2, that'll do it. This is actually, over the population squared, this is actually the solution to this differential equation if you want to use that. But basically what we're getting is the disease will climb and then have this very typical S-shaped curve, which is what we've seen in a number of models. What happens to make this dynamic is k is not a constant, because k depends on the probability of the disease spreading depends on the behavior of people. For example, are they going to, number 1, go into quarantine, and number 2, are they going to practice things such as hygiene, washing their hands, and so forth. So it depends on how many people you come into contact with, and it also depends on how well you do things such as wearing masks and hygiene, such as washing hands and face and so forth. Okay, so that's pretty well the model as we've done it. K will then be a dynamic because k is now also a function of time. But if k was static, this would then be the differential equation. But since it's separable, we can work in different functions over here and then maybe work with a model. This is very, very difficult, of course, to be able to extract in a form such as y as a function of time. But since it's a finite difference model, this is really what I'm using in the finite difference model, which makes it easier to use and easier to display, and then we can go back and look at it. So I'll go through a couple of pages of the PowerPoint so you can take a look at it. Mathematical modeling and COVID-19. Mathematical modeling is a technique of finding a mathematical model to portray what's going on, portray a physical event. It's more than just being able to match data, because we can, enough parameters, you can match data to anything, but there has to be an analytical basis for the model, or else it really is not that useful. So with COVID-19, we'll start off by assuming an exponential growth. Basically, the more people who have it, the faster it spreads. So limit to this growth. There's only so many people in the population to infect, and people build up an immunity. So there's a finite population. People build up an immunity as time goes on. Variables used are I, a number of people infected, k, that's a growth rate per day, which I had shown, n, the number of people not yet infected, as a population minus the number of people who are infected. I is the time step. The change in I, change the number of people who are infected, or what we call the daily cases. The daily case is just equal to k times the number of people infected. And each time step, we look to the previous time step, we multiply k times the number of people who are infected at that time. And this will give us an infinite number of people. So we put a taper on that. And when the number of people who have been infected is equal to the number of people who are not yet infected, all those people then become infected. And it means that that becomes 1. And 1 minus 1 is 0, and that will stop any more people from being infected in the model. The growth rate is actually the probability of contracting the disease. So it consists of two factors. One of the factors is the probability of contacting a carrier. So contacting a carrier, we'll call that E, and that basically is related to things like quarantining and social distancing. The probability of catching the disease from a carrier, should you come into contact with one, we'll label that as P. And P would depend on things like personal hygiene, wearing a mask, and PPE, and so forth. So K is equal to just E times P, and basically the growth factor is the probability of contact times the probability of infection. But K, however, is not a constant. People react to the situation, people start quarantining, people increase their personal hygiene, people start working together, a whole society starts working together, for example, and together people can very definitely reduce the growth rate. This can be measured by watching the value of K and how K changes over time. Now the change in K is called, I'm calling this the education or cooperation factor, and this is very, very important. It's one of the most important points as we're seeing this disease spread throughout the world and how countries are reacting to it. This change in K is coming out to being the dominant factor in being able to stop the disease and getting it to become extinct in your country. So now let's take a look at the data that we have here for India. Let's look at a particular country, and one of the countries we'll look at is India. We can see this is the daily cases graph, which everybody seems to be looking at. Unfortunately, it is extremely misleading. That is because this is the differential. This is how much things are changing. We can see that the number of cases is increasing. The number of daily cases is increasing, and on top of that, the number of cases is increasing as well. From here, we can see these are the recovered cases. These are the active cases. So a lot of the cases are active. This is really the graph we should be looking at. This is known as the active cases graph. If we look at the active cases graph over time, we can see that this is still increasing with more and more active cases. It has not leveled out, and it has not, if you like, leveled the curve in any sense of the word. These are the confirmed cases. This confirmed case, which is the blue line on top, that will go into like an S curve. And I don't think that this thing has even, in India, as far as India is concerned, this has not even gone through an inflection point on that S. So this is going to keep climbing. And this is, as far as India is concerned, is very early in the game. It's very, very early in the life of this epidemic in that country. So if we now go over to the model, we can see that we can match the total number of cases. These confirmed cases on the right, that's the actual data, and this is the total number of cases that we've modeled from an exponential growth with a taper, and the taper is nowhere near kicked in yet. And the reason, what we can measure is a couple of things here. One is, because that matches, we can have an initial K, which I had explained before. This, if I move it here, this value of K is at about almost 19%. So at the beginning it was growing at 19% a day, which is actually quite low. This is probably due to the fact that people in India may not be traveling from village to village or from place to place very much, not that much internal travel inside the country, and as a result it took a while to get going. But once it got going, it started to really take off. The other issue that we can measure now is this particular point known as the education rate, and that's how fast are the people responding. And this is a very, very low, only 1%. So it's only got a 1%, if you like, response rate or education rate or reaction rate, whatever you want to call it. And because it's so low, this disease is going to go on for quite a while. It's going to become growing in a static sort of, using a static model. Other countries that have gotten on top of this are countries like Taiwan, countries like New Zealand, that have really jumped on this early. And even though they had a much, much higher initial growth rate of almost 100% or more than 100% a day, because they have an education rate or I don't know, cooperation rate, if you like. They are reducing the growth rate at rates of about 12% a day, and maybe 14% a day at times. And as a result, they've annihilated the disease within a reasonable length of time. I think if countries really work together, they should be able to have this thing over and done with in about 100 days, I would think. So moving out, looking at confirmed cases, which now match total cases, this is the predictive model on the left. But here we now have active cases. Now, active cases, we can tell, according to the model, is still going to go up. This is after about 110 days. We have 110 days here and about 70,000 cases. So it at least can predict the number of active cases quite well. But to show one of the shortcomings, here we have the number of deaths. Number of deaths I've got too low. And the reason the number of deaths are too low in this particular model, this number of deaths are just about 3,500. I've got them at about 1,800. And the reason that is because if we look at the death rate over a period of time, I've set a death rate here on the left for the prediction of about 7%, which is this value here right at the end, because I'm constantly moving this value. However, it looks like if I was to make an average of this death rate, it would be higher. It would be the area of this spread out, if you like, maybe about 15 or almost double, which would then match, so that my prediction would then match up. So the number of deaths would match up what it is, about half of what it was, because I've got the death rate set at about half. There we can see the growth rate on the left. The growth rate on the left is not dying fast enough. Other countries have killed this very, very rapidly. Now I'm also going to go to another country. I'll go to Canada now. Here we are with the model. We'll go. This is Statsfolio. This is the actual data from Johns Hopkins. We'll now look at Canada, which is very interesting because we can see what's happening. Again, I have no idea why the country thinks this is over. It is still growing, even at the right-hand side. Now, the number of cases per day are less, but it is still growing. This showed that within the country, there were over 1,000 new cases in one single day. This thing is far from over. We have a large number of recovered compared to active, and it looks like the hospital system is still sort of on top of it. But now this blue line on top, this is still going up. Number of confirmed cases are still rising. It may be starting through an inflection point. This should go into an S curve, so maybe it's approaching that. But what is very interesting is when we go to the number of active cases, we see the number of active cases are still rising. These active cases still rising means it's not even halfway over. It may be that we have seen at this point here, which was a high point. I don't know if I can move in. Yes, I sort of can, I guess. But here we're seeing that these, at this point, right at the peak, all the provinces said it's all over, and they started to release people, and they started relaxing the quarantine because it was starting to drop a little bit. Now immediately it starts to rise. So this is the graph to look at. You have to wait till this graph is over. This graph here is very, very misleading and is not the graph to look at. So Canada now has a bit of a problem. Again, let's look at where we are, because I now have to change the predictive model. I had said, oh, I thought that this was the halfway point through, made a number of predictions, but then the people changed their behavior. People stopped their quarantine, and a lot of people have now relaxed the quarantine. So I'll now get that data. So I now grab all the data, put it into where we want it to go. So here I've put in Canada's data, and once again we see the graph on the left, which is total cases graph on the right, are confirmed cases. This is the actual data that came in. This is up 90,000 here. They match almost bang on. This is 90,000 here. This is 90,000. And this is saying that there's about 80,000 confirmed cases, which matches here. The graphs appear to look a little different. We see the significant S starting to form within Canada. However, there's a change of behavior around here. So this is not turning over like it was going to. It's now climbing up. So adjustments are made. And we now see the reason for this is that now Canada used to have what we would call as a learning curve rate, or a reactive rate of about 7.5%, sometimes 8%, 7.5%, because I've been watching this. Now it's dropped to only about 4.7%. So this has really dropped with the cooperation in order to fight it. And this shows up because people have released the quarantine, released the restrictions on the quarantine. And they've released the restrictions on the quarantine, if we go down to the active cases, right at the peak of the crisis. So on the right, we see the prediction, we see the actual data. It was about 35,000. This says it's going to hit about 40,000, which it may. If this takes off and goes up again, this may all of a sudden hit about 40,000. On the left side, as we see this graph here, this is what the active cases graph will look like. It'll go up and go down. We can get some estimate, some rough estimate on about how long will it take until this is over. So there is a fat tail on it, but there's also in some countries a very fat head on it coming in, and it'll have a very long period of time with few cases, and all of a sudden it explodes. And then as they're trying to kill it, it takes a long time for this to die, which is what's known as a fat tail, or a long tail. It's also known as a long tail. And there are some countries that contradict this. One is New Zealand, another one is Taiwan, where they're getting on top of this. But we have to take a look at the data and watch it. New Zealand had an active case, I think, yesterday. And today's date, just for the record, is May 25th, 2020. So now I'm going to show you a country that is completely different, because it totally blows the model away. So we should actually include something that doesn't work, and it doesn't work because they're not doing things that we wanted them to do. Well, not that we didn't want them to do. We want them to do it because they've gotten on top of it. But this is Mongolia, which now pretty well hammers. This is what the active cases looks like. We still see there are no deaths. We do have a lot of active cases. These active cases have to die. Not die, they have to be removed from them. They have to be resolved. They have to be resolved. Watch my language here, because this is unbelievably tragic, and many, many people have died, and many people are going to die. The number of recovered has to completely replace the number of active. They have had no deaths. And as far as I know, the number of cases came in from outside the country. There are no internal cases. So what we have seen here is that I noticed a few days ago that there were 56 new cases. I think that they may have come into the country, and then 36 new cases. So this thing can pop up at any time. Excuse me. But we have very few cases come in. Then I think 13 new cases did fly in, and they were immediately quarantined. And then there was this has been jumped on quickly by the country, and now no new cases have appeared up. These will have been in quarantine because of the policy in Mongolia. They are quarantining everything very, very rapidly, and they began the response in January. Before the disease actually hit the country, they were actually planning before they had any cases. So here we see, as I've said, the number of active cases is what we want to look at. So the confirmed cases, let me just do the confirmed cases here. The confirmed cases, even though there are very, very few, we can see that it's got this very, very long head on it. And then it pops up, and now we have this S curve has been established. Maybe a few more cases come in, or a few more active cases. We don't know. We hope not. But this looks like this is a distinctive S curve, even though there are very, very few cases. If we go to the active cases, this is where we see it has gone up, and there will be this prediction of going down the other side. So this is where this is at the top. And as these people recover, it looks like they all became sick at one time and they will recover sometime. So this will drop suddenly, I would think, which is as we go all the way through. So this is what it looks like right from the beginning. Confirmed cases, which we expect to be an S curve, has this very long head on it. And then I would predict that this is going to just drop off the edge. Now, where this now becomes very much goes against the model is when we now look at the model for Mongolia. We can see, because the data that I put in, the reaction rate is so high that the model simply can't keep up to it. It just simply kills the model. And this is exactly what the government wanted to do. So this shows the success of what they're doing. They can see that if they have a cooperative population, that this is far in excess, this far exceeds the ability of using a technology to be able to beat the disease, or massive amounts of money going into testing and so forth, just straight get the population to react through quarantine. And it's showing up more and more and more in the data that testing cannot possibly replace quarantining. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring in Mongolia's data. That will be here. Down we go. That will be in here. So we export Mongolia's data, save the file, and then we port that over to, and here we have the model for Mongolia, which is brought in. Now we can see on the right, this is the actual real data, but we can see that this model just absolutely breaks down. It just says, oh, it should only have like 1.5 cases. And of course, you can only have an integral number of cases. We go down, we see the number of active cases has hit about 120 and is now going off, as is typical. And I think there will be a sharp drop. Now, the reason this model collapses, because what I've got here is on this learning curve, which is so important. When I put in the data for Mongolia, I've got a 95% learning curve, which means the growth rate dies. The growth rate dies by 95% of the growth rate per day. In other words, they kill the growth rate within a day. Everyone in the country reacts. Their practice sort of emergency response, and they'll shut an entire city down with just one case. One case shows up. If they had something like, I think they just had an increase of about 35 cases or something, that would have caused everyone to go into a mad panic. Everything shuts down. No one sticks their nose out onto the street or anything. They are isolated immediately, and it waits until the all clear is sounded. And as a result, the disease is killed in its tracks. So far, I don't think they have any locally transmitted diseases. And all of these have come in from outside. Anytime someone comes in from the outside, those are the ones who are tested. So they don't have to have massive amounts of testing, just everybody who comes into the country. And as soon as they do that, they're able to stop it, or detect it, and just destroy it almost immediately. This is obviously cannot grow with an exponential growth. So the assumption that I made, that it grows exponentially, simply does not hold. However, we are seeing the power of a country that works together and can kill this thing by working together. So those are some models to show that we can get some idea and get a picture of what is working and what is not working, or what is, should have been working much better but doesn't seem to be doing it. Of what happens when you read the wrong graph. All of a sudden it points up immediately. We have a disastrous situation that could be happening in a country like Canada. We have difficulty in India in trying to get a cooperation throughout the whole country. A country like Canada would be able to cooperate, I think. However, it is having problems in simply reading the wrong graph and giving not clear instructions or clear direction. Mongolia has very clear direction, very clear instructions, easy to understand, easy to follow instructions to its people, and its people are uniting and responding accordingly, and that's what's killing this disease. As far as Mongolia is concerned, let's see if we can get something out of this. Of course, active cases, we say it's when the active cases die. Of course, here we see the growth rate over here gets killed within a day and a half. It's dead. So active cases, um, could be going on. I don't know. I think they could kill this thing within 100 days, is what I've been saying, but maybe not. Maybe about 200 days, it'll be completely clear in the country, or 100 days all told. But the people will survive this. This will not really affect them when they come out of it. Their economy will be in great shape compared to the rest of the world because they've just simply done the right thing, and they still have the infrastructure within their society, the companies and so forth that are happening. Yes, it's a hit on the economy, uh, but it's not going to be nearly as bad as the other countries in the world. They've made the right decision, is what has happened here. So now let's look at the economy. Now, from a predictive point of view, we can only look at very large, if you like, all-encompassing parameters and so forth, and try and take a guess. And things get better and better as we have more and more data as we're beginning to approach the target. So at the beginning, with the economy, we were in a process of centralization. There was more centralization and concentration of capital, which was going on, and there is also a systemic process within the structure of our economic system, and that is to basically protect the status quo. And the status quo is, of course, to keep the capital in the hands of those who already have it. And other words, there's more and more concentration of capital, and these funds move towards more and more areas of least risk. So it's a risk aversion type of system. So as a result, if it's a risk aversion type of system, this is based on scenarios that have happened in the past. Because trying to predict anything in the future carries a considerable amount of risk with it. You might be wrong. And so with risk aversion, you look at everything that's happening in the past. You try and figure out what you can do in the future. And as a result, this is a reactive model. So everything is now going in a reactive model, and to try and make things protect the status quo, to protect the amount of capital in the hands of those who already have it. So the decision-making model is a reactionary model. It's not proactive, and it can't approach problems in a proactive way. Predictive models do work, however. They give us some ideas, and they can tell us kind of what's going to happen if we do certain things. For example, if we end the quarantine too soon, we can make some sort of reasonable prediction of what's going to happen. For example, within the United States, we could possibly predict between 800,000 to 1.2 million dead people within the United States. So I wanted to investigate whether or not this is a black swan event. Now, a black swan event is an unpredictable event, completely unpredictable. Gray swan is, it's kind of predictable, and a white swan means it was absolutely predictable. Now, we're going to start talking in this, now that we've set the parameters. I'm going to talk about someone who is blind versus someone who is seeing or sight capable. And things could happen to a blind person, which would be completely unpredictable to the blind person, but to a seeing person would have been very, very predictable. So we have an unpredictable, which is unpredictable. So to a blind person would be a black swan, in effect, but to a person who can see, it would be a white swan. So now if we have this system, this systemic system, we have a system to protect the status quo, which is only reactionary, and it must do everything to protect the status quo. Then on top of that, we will place a belief, a solid belief, that our perceptions determine reality. If we can just get everybody to believe the right thing, then that will be, the reality will be that it's the right thing. And when we have a crisis come in, if the system itself cannot react to it because it's unprecedented, and then starts pumping out as though seems everything's okay, this means that society itself becomes blind to the actual crisis it is facing. So in that way, I'm saying that this crisis is really a black swan, because even though it was predictable, even though people knew the consequences of it, it was ignored because the society itself is blind. Okay, and because society is blind, because it has denied, in very blunt terms, it's denied the existence of reality. It has believed solidly that through perception, it can actually save the economy, or that this crisis will just in some way go away. And that is not the case at all. And there are some very, very severe consequences to what we are seeing. There are some countries that saw that this was real and they reacted and they're on top of it. There are countries that felt that they didn't know how drastic it was going to be, but when they saw how drastic it was, they locked it down. There are other countries that were releasing their quarantine right at the peak of the crisis, at the time when there are the most active cases, and the active cases are now going through the roof for these countries. This is a terrible, terrible tragedy and a terrible situation.